All right, welcome everybody. I'm your host, Drew the Dragonslayer Thomas, coming to you live both online and in person from the Norman Rockwell Museum. The mission of the museum is to illuminate the power of American illustration art, to reflect and shape society and advance the enduring values of kindness, respect, and social equity that's portrayed in Norman Rockwell's art. I'll begin by reading our land acknowledgement. It is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land on which the museum was built. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. So now I'd like to welcome you all to the 8th and final episode of our Tuesday program, Meet the Artist series. We'll be talking with some of the most talented illustrators and painters of our generation, as well as you all, the audience, both online and in person, who we encourage to be a part of the conversation as well. Today, we're thrilled to be talking with Gary Gianni. Gary will speak about the beginning of his career and early influences. Then he'll speak about his work on comics, illustrations, and the differences between them. Then he'll talk about his 8 years drawing the syndicated newspaper strip Prince Valiant, and then his time working with George R.R. Martin on his Game of Thrones Song of Ice and Fire series. Finally, he'll talk about his current projects. So we're grouping the presentation by theme, so we invite you to ask relevant questions as he shares about each topic, and at the end, we'll open the floor for additional questions. Now I'd like to introduce Stephanie Habush Plunkett, the Deputy Director and Chief Curator of the Norman Rockwell Museum. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Drew, and welcome everybody. It's so good to see you, our in-person audience, our online audience. We are really happy to have you with us. Many thanks to our staff and interns working behind the scenes to make this program possible. We're really thankful to you all. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Gary Gianni. I'd like to tell you a little bit about him. He's extremely accomplished. Gary Gianni follows in the footsteps of artists like Howard Pyle, Emcee, Wyeth and Hal Foster, as he illustrates classic tales such as John Henry, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Moby Dick, and Kidnapped. With a strong appreciation for the characters created by Robert E. Howard, Gianni's work has been featured in recent books, featuring Howard's writing, including The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane, The Bloody Crown of Conan, and Bran Mac Morn, The Last King. After Gianni graduated from Chicago Academy of Fine Arts in 1976, he worked for the Chicago Tribune and for network television news as a courtroom sketch artist. He later put his drawing skills to work as a comics artist for Classic Illustrated, The Shadow, and the Monster Men. His pen and ink illustrations for Prince Valiant comic strip, which he created for nearly a decade, prepared him for his role as an artist for George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire books, which are the basis for the popular Game of Thrones television series. Gianni and his amazing work have been the subject of several books, including the Prince Valiant page and the art of Gary Gianni for George R.R. Martin's Seven Kingdoms. He also wrote and illustrated Gary Gianni, Mysterious Islands, and Gary Gianni's Monster Men and Other Stories. And he adapted and illustrated 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which featured an introduction by the legendary author Ray Bradbury. He is the recipient of a prestigious Eisner Award for his illustrations of Heroes, a tale included in Batman Black and White. Gary's art is featured in our current exhibition, which I hope you've had a chance to see, or if you're online, maybe we'll hopefully see you here soon. But the exhibition is called Enchanted, A History of Fantasy Illustration. And Gary is represented by actually two works, a painting of Robert E. Howard's Bran Mac Morn and a pen and ink drawing of Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons, which he created for George R.R. Martin's 2020 book, A Storm of Swords. We are thrilled to have you with us, Gary. Thank you so much. Look forward to this discussion.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for inviting me today to the Norman Rockwell Museum. This has been a great series, and I think a lot of the illustrators discussing their work thus far has been entertaining, insightful, and very interesting. I hope I have something I can offer here today that will keep those high standards intact.
No doubt.
Anyway, I don't want this to be a monologue, and I hope people who have questions will chime in whenever they can, and I'm certainly happy to try to give a response. So keep that in mind. And we have a lot to discuss over the next hour or so, and I think maybe we ought to get right to it. So
that sounds great, Gary. Where would you like to start?
Well, I'd like to start right from the beginning, actually. I don't know if you've ever had a chance, anybody there has ever had a chance to make a presentation like this, but I think you'll find yourself reflecting on your own journey as you compile information about yourself. And I have a quote here: "All grown-up craft depends on sustaining a frozen moment from childhood." This is a quote from Adam Gopnik from an article that he wrote about professional magicians. And these are what impressed them in their youth that led them to spend the rest of their lives practicing their crafts as magicians. I think we all get this question asked us at times in our lives. You don't need to be an artist, whatever your obsession is or your career path. Someone might be obsessed with baseball, for example, or they want to grow up and be a veterinarian, and people will say, well, how did you arrive at that decision? Where did that come from? These are answers or questions that aren't easy to answer. In my case, I wanted to be an illustrator when I was a little kid. Specifically, at the very beginning, I wanted to be a cartoonist and a comic book artist. And I suppose it starts with something that made a big impression on me. That frozen moment was when I saw this cover to this Fantastic Four when I was about 10 years old. And I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. I remember even copying it at the time. And I wondered if I'd ever be able to do anything quite as impressive as Jack Kirby's creation here. Flash forward to 40 years later, I created this painting of Bran McMorn fighting on this hill of Romans. And while that comic book was not a conscious thought in my head as I created this painting, I wonder in retrospect if there is some connection here. Perhaps people out there might be able to help me walk my way through this thing as I talk about my career and help me find some of these connections, because they're not quite as obvious as you're doing them as they are in retrospect. Of course, films, like most of us, and I think a lot of the other illustrators in this series talked about films, whether it's Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. One of my big frozen moments was the Mysterious Island movie and a lot of the Harryhausen stuff that was being created back in the 60s, the giant monsters and so forth. Now here's a Prince Valiant page on the right that I did 30 years later, where I overtly copied something that I recalled from my youth. And I remember what a big impression those giant crabs made on me at the time. This page you're looking at here is a page that was written by Mark Schultz, and it was colored by Ruth and Jim Keegan. One thing I want to mention about color, I'm not going to get into color at all on our show today because we just don't have the time for it. And basically, I never color my black and white work. I always think of it in terms of black and white. So I have to rely on other people to color my work. I might be able to give them notes, but not much more than that, especially when it's colored in, digitally. This is a point I'd like to make right now, that there have been a lot of people over the years, ever since I was a kid, who helped me in my life. And I would be nowhere without their help, right up to today. I almost, the theme here today should be, I get by with a lot of help from my friends. And you'll see as I go along, I'll probably be dropping a few names, but it's important to remember how much the community at large, starting with my family, my mom and dad, and my brother, of course, helped me throughout my career.
Gary, I was curious about that. Was drawing encouraged in your household, and was it a kind of a creative environment that inspired some of this?
Yes, heavily, actually. Not only was my grandfather a amateur painter, but my uncle was also encouraging as well. And this is really important, and I'll touch on this a little later to follow through with this more. We'll leave it at that for a moment, but I'm going to come back to your question very short.
Thank you.
You're looking here at, and I'll be brief with my early days. Of course, I was into monsters in grade school, and even in early years of high school, I was already trying to draw comic strips. I remember distinctly at a young age, I think I was about 15 years old, and I bought this Jack Kirby original art page. And I pored over this thing looking at the technique. It was, I think Dick Ayers inked this page of Kirby's pencils. But I bring it out to mention, at least for young artists, how important it is to try and look at original artwork when you can, as opposed to printed reproductions, because those reproductions will never really give you the little insights you need into technique and some of the aspects of drawing and even painting. So the more you can get to museums or conventions where there's a lot of original art, the better. In later years in high school, I think my drawing was improving quite a bit. And I found this pencil here on the left. On the right, you'll see something I worked on in high school, but I did not ink it. I almost hesitated to put this picture in here. But again, I wanted to bring out this idea that you brought up earlier, Stephanie, about making sure that you have a connection to other people, not only your family, but by the time I was in high school, I was meeting other kids who wanted to be artists. And this was inked by a guy who was a year ahead of me. And he was really into Frazetta and Al Williamson. And we got very excited about talking about comics all the time. And we had all this common ground. And I learned a lot from him and some of the other kids that I went to high school with. That doesn't happen very often, but in my case it did. And again, I'm so blessed that I made those kind of connections because they lasted for years.
Did any of those kids go on to be professional artists like yourself?
Yes, they did. The guy who inked that page, his name is Jerry Taratilli, and he went on to a successful career as an illustrator. Another good friend of mine, Rick Burnell, is an illustrator, and I've known these guys my entire life for over 50 years. Excuse me. So you know, it's been very rewarding to have these kind of friends. I might add, even in college, I went to an art school. I didn't go to a college. I went to an art school, and there, of course, I met even more artists who wanted to do the same thing I did. Scott Gustafson was one of them. He was a friend of mine and a classmate, and it still is to this day. Jeff Darrow, another extremely talented guy who went on to a phenomenal career. These were my friends, and they were my circle, and we spent a lot of time together. These pieces you're looking at here are professional jobs that I was already doing when I was in art school. A reporter walked through the halls of the Chicago Academy once and saw some things I had hanging in a show, and asked me if I wanted to do some work for the Chicago Sun-Times, which was one of the big newspapers in Chicago. So the piece on the left there is my first professional job. And I think that was done about in the mid 70s sometime.
Gary, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Just before we get too far away from your teenage years, there's a question from the online audience who asked,
sure.
They asked, may I ask what Jack Kirby page that inspired you enough to purchase it as a teenager? What book? Did that make sense?
Yeah, it did. It was a Strange Tales Human Torch page. I don't think the Human Torch is in it, but I just like the occult content of the page with this magician on the page. And I liked the inking. It was all in brush, by the way. Dick Ayers inked that Kirby page all in brush. And at this time, even in this first job I did here for the Sun-Times, I was still working with brush. I quickly developed a pen line style when I started working regularly for the newspapers. But early on there, you can see the changeover from brushwork to pen line. And again, I'm sorry, I apologize for breezing through here, but we do have a lot we want to get through. And I just want to say I moved from newspaper work into working for television, where I found myself doing courtroom drawings for a number of years for many of the television stations in Chicago. That in of itself was a drawing workshop, and I learned a lot from having to work quickly and working spontaneously, trying to get gestures and so forth. I remember being in a courtroom one time with a reporter where a verdict was read and someone was convicted of a crime, and the man's wife, who was near me, she stood up all of a sudden and she fainted. And the reporter turned to me and said, "Did you get that?" And I said, "Well, no, not really. I'm not a camera." And he said, "Well, you're going to need to recreate that." And I found myself feverishly working after the trial was over to get a drawing done quickly enough where they could pin it to the wall of the courtroom and shoot it for the noon feed for the news. So the deadlines were tough, and it wasn't something I particularly enjoyed, but I did a lot of courtroom work. And to this day, whenever I see a courtroom going, I'm amazed at the people who do that stuff. It's a lost art, actually. I think with cameras coming into courtrooms, there's less and less of this sort of work being done. Anyway, we'll move on. Okay, we're moving along through the years, and here I am 4 or 5 years later, still doing a lot of work for newspapers. I was also working for magazines at the time. There used to be a lot of magazines in Chicago, the American Bar Association, business magazines, woodworking magazines, all, you name it. And they all needed artwork. My friends and I, we provided a lot of, we learned our craft doing these magazines and newspaper work. I loved it when I'd get a chance to do something historical for the newspapers, like this piece right here. Generally, there were a lot of business magazines who would request, can you draw two executives shaking hands? I don't know how many times I drew images of lawyers shaking hands, but I put an end to that at some point. This finally led from doing color magazine work for a number of years, and I apologize for moving quickly, but I found myself starting to get work from New York for book covers. And at first I was doing a lot of children's book covers. Considering that I originally wanted to be a comic artist, I found that I was moving into areas that delighted me and excited me as much as the comics did, especially because I became more and more interested in the golden age of illustration. And of course, people like Emcee, Wyeth, Leyendecker, and of course, Rockwell. A visit to the Brandywine Museum when I was about 25 with Scott and my brother Tom really inspired me to want to paint more.
Gary, were you seeking work from publishers at that time, or did somebody happen to come upon one of your illustrations and invite you to illustrate?
A little bit of both. I think I was fortunate with people seeing my work and asking if I wanted to try something that they had to offer. Many times I did just walk into something. I was lucky back then to find people who would be interested in using me to do their projects. But after all those years of wanting to draw comic books, I was about 33, I think, when I walked into an office here in Chicago that was doing, they were trying to revamp Classics Illustrated. And I showed them my work. And here's one of the jobs I actually went after and pursued to try and get. And
Gary, if you don't mind, I just want to check before we move on with the presentation if we have any questions from the in-person audience.
By all means, by all means.
Because I think someone might have wanted to ask a question. Am I correct in thinking that? Oh, doesn't look like we do actually. Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, that's fine. Anyway, something like the Gift of the Magi here gave me a chance to do not only a painted cover, but also do the ink line work within the interiors of the books. They appeared in color, but again, I always felt as if my work in black and white should just remain black and white, but I know comics need to be in color. And by the way, it's a good point, a time to mention, I made a good portion of my living with this little bottle right here, this pen point. More so than maybe some other illustrators. I found if it weren't for the ink and the pen, I might have been sleeping in the street at points. But I did do a lot of pen line work, and it advanced and got a little more sophisticated as it went along. From the Gift of the Magi, I found myself doing 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which again was a classic novel, and it appealed to me on many levels because now we're getting into high fantasy and adventure. And here on the right, you'll see I was experimenting with a technique, scratchboard a little bit, to try and get those engraving looks that some of the illustrations of the 19th century had.
Did you create the typography there as well?
No, that again was done by a talented guy, Jim Keegan. He colored a lot of my comic strip work and still does.
Thank you.
On the subject of pen and ink, I thought I'd put together just a quick little legacy of names for anyone who's interested in maybe learning a little bit more about pen line artists down throughout the last 500 years. Here we have a good array of people who have influenced me. And you can see there's quite a few different styles there, but nonetheless, they all come into play. And originally I just had names for the icons at the top. And after I finished that, I thought, oh yeah, by the way, there's also all these other guys. So I wrote out these names on the bottom. And then the other day, a friend of mine said, oh yeah, but you left out John R. Neal and you left out Norman Lindsay. And I said, oh, well, it can go on. But all these guys are wonderful pen line illustrators. And they're certainly work, if you aren't familiar with them, looking at their work, and you'll see where some of my inspirations come from.
Speaking of your influences, Lynn from the online audience asked, did J. Allen St. John influence you? Yes,
he influenced me as well. Now there's an illustrator who worked not only in paint, but in pen and ink. So I did find a great deal in common with him, and his pulp work and his work for all the Burroughs books continues to inspire me. And it was nice to see that at the museum, right next to where I'm hanging, is a painting by the artist you just mentioned, who all of a sudden I'm blanking on. Al St. John, sorry.
J. Allen St. John. Yep.
J. Allen St. John. Yes. He's also from Chicago, by the way. And I used to go to a workshop where he lived in that apartment building. And there was still pipe smoke of his floating around in there, I think, somewhere.
And if I could,
pardon me?
Oh, I'm sorry, you're good to go ahead.
J.C. Call was a huge influence on me. And another one of the illustrations hanging at the in the enchantment show is this piece from The Lost World on the left. And I was just delighted to be able to spend some time looking closely at the original, because my drawing on the right, which is from an illustration from Solomon Kane, was largely inspired by the piece of Call's. Of course, I was only looking at a reproduction. This was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So I was, again, I was delighted, and I can't, mention enough how important it is for especially young illustrators to be able to look at original art. You can see the pen line work is, I've copied it to the point where I was pretty happy with that piece. Anyway, working on some of those classics projects led to me getting a chance to go over to Dark Horse and do some work for these guys at Dark Horse. Imagine how things were when someone over there, an editor, said, well, we have an Indiana Jones, we've licensed Indiana Jones, and we're wondering, do you want to write and draw an Indiana Jones comic? And of course, I jumped at that. So here was a chance to not only illustrate, but also to write a story as well. And I think we could talk about the mechanics of comics. That's worth a whole nother show. And I know we have to move along, but there are so many aspects a comic artist has to take into consideration that are make him or her different from an illustrator. I'd love to have a discussion sometimes on the difference between illustration, one single panel illustration, and sequential art. You need an extra toolbox when you're doing sequential art. And I think there are a few examples I have along the way here that might be able to enlighten you a little bit more on that point. But here's a pencil on the left. I always draw out my pencils and then I put them on a light box and redraw them in pencil, and then ink that. So at the finish, I'll have a pencil and I'll have an ink drawing. So I have all my old pencils as well. And again, I was able to paint the cover here. And I remember someone saying, oh, you're going to be doing some work for Lucas, and they have a lot of restrictions on their characters. You're writing that story. They say they have a whole Bible on what you can do and what you can't do with Indiana Jones. So after I read the script, or after the script was sent to Lucasfilm, someone over there called me and said, you know, we don't have any problem with your script except for one thing. You mentioned that Indiana Jones has an uncle. Now, we're not sure if he does have or have not have an uncle. So you have to change that line, which I was happy to do. I was surprised. I got off as easy as I did. And I really enjoyed doing that work. The Indiana Jones comic led to me being asked to work on the Shadow, which I liked since I was a high school kid, the idea of the Shadow. It was Michael Kaluta, who the great comic artist and illustrator, who brought me on to do the Shadow. He was writing with his friend Joel Goss, and I did the illustration work. There's a thing, comic artists, it's funny that they call some people illustrators and other people comic artists. That's the trouble with words, I think. I'm not quite sure where one starts and one leaves off. Again, I think at times we get hung up on words. Cartoonists are another example of that grouping that I think they all overlap. And I wish we could kind of find some way of bringing them all together. I mentioned that I was a big fan of the Shadow when I was in art school and when I was in high school. And on the left is a page that I did probably about 20 some years prior to the page on the right. Little did I know that someday I'd actually get the chance to draw the Shadow. So you'll see that life works in mysterious ways. I suppose there's as much of a look at the human psychology in some of this stuff as there is talking about art. And the nature of creativity is pretty mysterious. I'm not quite sure where how these connections ultimately wind up being made. I didn't go after this Shadow job. It came to me. But you know, again, I was very fortunate. And the fact that I had these friends that were able to help me. While we're talking about genres and groupings of artists, there's a whole nother group of artists that I think haven't probably gotten very much play during the series, the summer series. And those are the pulp artists. They were generally known for, I have a few here, for their rich covers. The colors were very bold and very graphic. And as a matter of fact, here's a J. Allen St. John cover right here for Weird Tales. So I'd love to see a show of pulp artists somewhere, hopefully someday, maybe even at the Norman Rockwell Museum. But I found myself doing a lot of shadow paintings where I was trying to imitate those pulp artists. I love their big shapes.
I'd love to ask another question from the online audience, if that's all right.
Sure.
I know you do a lot of different kind of mediums. So this person asked, what attracted you about illustration specifically, as opposed to other forms of drawn or painted art?
I don't know if I make any distinction between illustration and other forms of art. it's a good question, but I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I suppose if I were left alone to just do anything, if I had a blank check, I'd probably paint another picture of the shadow. whether or not that helps is.
And you kind of answered it when you were talking about how muddying the words and the definitions are it's kind of gray. So.
Yeah,
Actually, maybe as a follow-up to that question, which is a really good one. Gary, did you actually study illustration? Were there illustration classes at your art school?
yes, I did have a couple of illustration teachers. Some were good, some weren't all that terrific, but two that I learned a lot from, Phil Renault, who was an illustrator. He worked for Playboy magazine and a number of high-end publications, was not only a teacher, but he was a lifelong friend of mine as well. And again, I have to say, I had these wonderful people that have helped me throughout my career.
I'd love to ask one more.
Sure.
It is a three-parter, but they're easy ones, so don't worry. They ask, what work are you most proud of? What is the most surprising thing that has happened to you in your illustration career? And how the heck did you land the Indiana Jones assignment?
Okay, well, I don't know. I don't have an answer to any of those. You know, this is all jumbling around in my head, even as we unfold this thing here. And I wish I had a good answer for those questions. The Indiana Jones thing just fell in my lap. Again, I had no background for writing and drawing an Indiana Jones comic. And as you see, as I move along here, you'll find some other projects have landed in my lap that came out of the blue. And they're all mysterious. It's part of life that, you know, if some of your audience can explain it to me, then turn that camera around and have them speak.
Thank you.
Sorry, I don't have a good answer for any of
Oh,
those.
it's absolutely fine. A lot of artists we've had it's difficult for them to say what work they're most proud of because they love all their work.
Yeah, you can see from my work that I have kind of a checkered career, and it gets more checkered as we go along. So I have favorite sections of each of these segments.
All right.
Well, one thing led to another, and here I am at DC. They saw some of the Pulp covers that I was doing, and at the time they were doing this series of Hulk covers for their comics, and I did Superboy and Green Lantern and Batman. And if I can throw, excuse me for all this name dropping, but again, Alex Ross, who's a Chicago guy, and I'm sure you all know Alex Ross. He was instrumental into getting me some work at DC. I didn't particularly go after it, but it was through Alex that I wound up working at DC, which led me to working not only on some covers, but on a short story for Batman Black and White that was written by somebody I liked since I was a kid. And he's not often mentioned today, and he really needs to be given a lot more credit. When I was a kid, I was reading eerie and creepy. Look at this great Frazetta cover here. I love this. But most of the stories in here are written by Archie Goodwin. So I had the chance later in my career to work with Archie. He penned the story Heroes, and I got to draw it. It was Alex. He originally wrote it for Alex Toth, but Toth turned it down for some reason. He wanted something that was he wanted something with Alfred the Butler in it. I'm not quite sure why, but Archie had written the story with gyroplanes and blimps in it, and it's stuff that Alex Toth loved, but he didn't want to do it. Anyway, I wound up with the story, and it was a high point for me. You asked me about favorite moments. This was one of them, to work with Archie Goodwin. I remember his script called for Batman to be landing on top of a car where he's fighting these bad guys. And I said, well, if you don't mind, can we make it a truck? That way I can put more bad guys in the truck. And he said, oh, that's great. So, and that's the thing about working on comic strips. They're collaborative. And when I have worked with writers, I found this great kind of organic synthesis working together where we go back and forth. I'm not just given a script and following it with heavy-handed art direction. We were always, at least the guys I worked with, it was always a back and forth dialogue. So, again, I was lucky here.
Gary, are there any particular challenges that come with drawing and painting licensed characters? Characters that the audience really feels like they know. And
well, from both aspects, drawing and writing licensed characters. First of all, you have the companies that own them that have some say-so in the work. And the second part of your question was pardon me again.
Only that, I wondered how you thought about dealing with characters that were so well known in new and interesting ways.
Well, there's sort of a built-in expectation for high branded characters. Audiences have a proprietary connection with them. And at times it is a bit of a struggle to meet those expectations. I've been, I suppose, fortunate enough to straddle the fence where I don't seem to have rattled too many fans. With Prince Valiant and the Game of Thrones, the Song of Fire and Ice stuff, I did find myself at times running into expectations from fans that weren't exactly how I saw characters. But we'll cross that. I mean, sorry to push that off, but we'll come to that again shortly.
Gary, just while maybe this is a question for the last slide, but our online audience asks, what kinds of references do you use for these poses?
Well, that's a good question. Comic artists, I think, have to, at some point, just throw reference over their shoulders and make things up, or just have really great retention skills to draw what they're doing. It's almost impossible to just reference everything. As a matter of fact, I'd have to say, I'd go out on a limb and say, at times, illustrators can have too much reference. And for myself, I think at times too much reference tends to tie me up more. And if I find that I have to make something up many times, especially in my roughs where I am making things up, I actually like the spontaneity or the stylings more than when I rely on reference. So it's a combination of both. There's no one thing you can look at and say, well, I get all my ideas from this book or that book. But it helps if you're drawing things that you're interested in. So
Thank you. Speaking of making things up, this is kind of a forced segue, but have you ever thought of creating your own independent art projects or stories? And if so, what would that look like? And if you're going to talk about that later, that's fine too.
Well, that's a good question to pose right now, because it was Hellboy's creator, Mike Mignola, who was gracious enough to ask me to come up with an idea for a backup story for his Hellboy comics. Again, this was something I kind of just walked into. And here I was given a blank check to create some characters that might fit into, be appropriate for the sort of stuff Mike was doing at the time. So I relied on my love of monsters, which stems all the way back, here's a little inset. I still have my Aurora models from when I was a kid, and my mother painted those things. And I remember how meticulously detailed she was with some of the little details on the monsters. But those sort of things inform us as well, or informed me anyway. So when I was asked to come up with something, it was the Monster Men series, a combination of all the stuff I liked as a kid and the pulp stuff I liked later on, all rolled up into one. So that, I hope, figures into your answer a little bit.
Perfect. No, thank you.
I just stuck this in here to give you guys an idea how I felt about 5 minutes after agreeing to do one of these presentations. It was something that, yes, it's a little intimidating, especially after all the great illustrators you had on earlier. You know, please just let me know when, you know, my time's up and you can pull the cane out and cut me off. But hopefully this picture has a big smile on it when this is over. We talk a little bit more about the mechanics of comics. And here again is how I go about laying out a comic page. This is one of my Monster Men comics. And I wrote this scene where a demon is causing havoc on a street corner. And on the top left, you'll see a little thumbnail, which is about, 4 by 4 inches, 4 by 3 inches or so, not very big, where I work out my breakdowns. And from that, you can see it's fairly faithful all the way to the finish, with the pencil in the middle, and then the finished ink at the last stage of the game. And again, you can see here, this is a good example, your question earlier about reference. You know, especially when you're doing something like this, there comes a point, well, you just have to start making stuff up. I think if you were going to try to build some reference for something like this, it would take you weeks, and comic artists don't have that kind of time. Speaking of some of the differences between comic artists and illustrators, here's, I think, a very good example of what I was talking about earlier. On the left, you have a small breakdown that I did of this dead guy getting up off a slab and attacking somebody who was in the hull of a ship. Now, when I originally did this page, I had him strangling this guy at the end of the page, and that's what it called for. Mike Mignola and I worked out that, well, he kills the guy, and as I was working out the page, I realized I could come up with a better idea, something a little more cinematic than merely another shot of mayhem and the guy getting strangled. So what I did was I had this falling toolbox on the floor instead. And I think that suggested all the violence that, and maybe even more so, than you could put in a panel like the one on the left. It's a good example of a comic artist and the way they use cinematic techniques and apply it to their art. They all do it, and I just thought this was a good example of that. As I was doing comics, and I loved doing them, the opportunity came from London, where a publisher was starting up, and they were going to be producing a series of works of Robert E. Howard, a fine press editions of the novels of Robert E. Howard. And the editor and instigator behind that was a fellow by the name of Marcello Anciano. And he asked me if I wanted to do the Savage Tales of Solomon Kane. And this was my big moment to start trying to live up to the, at least the smock, the hem of Emcee Wyeth, his painting smock. Again, I really enjoyed doing these classic books. And they're limited in print. There are trades of them, but they're not quite as elegant and lavishly produced as you'll see in some of these slides. The Solomon Kane book required about 100 ink line illustrations and about 8 or 9 paintings, some of which you'll see on the walls around here. But it was a whole nother chapter in my life that moved me away from comics, probably for the rest of my career. And I got into just book illustration. I really enjoy it. And I think some of these next few slides here will give you an example of some of the painting work I was doing for the series, the Wandering Star series. They varied in tone, and Robert E. Howard's stories move so quickly. They're an illustrator's dream. You can see why so many people like illustrating Robert E. Howard's work. There's just so many scene changes, some of them on one page. Finally, I got to, yes.
Sorry, I just have a quick question from the audience here. We were speaking of Mike Mignola and Hellboy earlier. Do you have any plans to return to the Mignola-verse?
Well, you never know, but it's possible. You know, again, I nothing in the immediate future anyway. Sorry, I can't give you a better answer on that.
That's okay. Kind of an interesting question. Somebody just simply asked, are you a shy introvert?
Yes. Why, do you pick that up from this?
It's not me, I'm just the messenger, but
if you pick this up from this presentation, then I'm not doing well enough at covering all that shy introvertedness up. Sorry.
It's okay. I didn't necessarily pick it up, so you're doing good in my book.
Oh, good, great. Thank you. You don't notice the beaded sweat on my forehead. Let's talk a little bit about some of the the things that helped inform a painting, for example. That if I walk you back to the beginning, where did I get the idea from for several of these things? There's a Cornwell painting here on the left. I always liked that composition. Look at those great big abstract shapes and so forth. And I love the attitude of that guy sitting in the chair, some sort of a deck chair or an Adirondack chair. At any rate, when I was working on a Conan painting, and I remembered that painting. And you can see the direct influence in the not only the layout, but in the attitude, at least of the guy in the chair. Eventually, the painting comes out like this, but I think you can see that you can make that connection, can't you? I hope so.
Yeah, most definitely. Even in the perspective, in looking down slightly at the figures, that's wonderful.
Yeah, even the having the thing in the foreground there, the little table, all of these things. Again, we don't work in a vacuum. I don't think any artist does, and we're often influenced by things that wind up in our paintings, and some of it's unconscious, and some of it's conscious. Again, just a quick note on technique. I generally do an underpainting, and here's an example of a small underpainting and a finished painting.
That kind of answers.
Yes.
Sorry, just really quickly, that kind of answers half of this question from the online audience. They ask, I'd love to know how you begin a picture. What is your composition process like?
Well, glad you asked that, because we'll come to that after this Prince Valiant intermission.
Perfect.
From working on those Wandering Star books, which I could have done for the rest of my life, I got a call from the King Features newspaper syndicate, and I was asked to work on the Prince Valiant comic strip. I was on the fence about it because I didn't know anything about Prince Valiant. He was a character I didn't necessarily follow throughout my teenage years. I mean, I knew who Hal Foster was, and I loved Hal Foster's work, but I didn't follow Prince Valiant. At any rate, I wound up working with John Cullen Murphy. And this is going to be a side little venture on John Cullen Murphy. And it gets back to what I wanted to talk about at the beginning about those frozen moments, because Murphy figures into this somewhat. He was one of the last of the golden age illustrators. And when he was a boy, and maybe some of you know this out there, but he was doing the Prince Valiant strip for 30 years. But when he was a kid, he lived next door to Norman Rockwell. And Rockwell saw him, of course, playing ball and so forth, and asked his mother if he could use him as a model. And he started modeling for Norman Rockwell. Now you have that wonderful picture at the museum, the Land of Enchantment. And I think it's so great that we can tie all this together because John Cullen Murphy is in that painting. He is the David Copperfield boy on the right, walking next to the pirate. And I used to ask John Cullen Murphy when I worked with him on Prince Valiant, what it was like to know some of these golden age illustrators. And he was reticent about it, but he'd talk about Rockwell sometimes. And he brought up the time he was in the studio when Rockwell was working on this picture. It was 1935 or 36, somewhere in there. And he remembers another young boy, a model coming into the Rockwell studio. It was the little boy behind the tree on the left, holding the magic lamp. And John Cullen Murphy sat and watched Norman Rockwell and his assistant photographer shoot the lad. And when he was done, Rockwell went over to the boy and said, "Hold out your hands." And he poured a whole handful of change into this kid's hands. And the kid said, I'm dreaming. It was the Depression, so that made a big impression on not only Murphy, but on, of course, on the little boy. But I just love those little anecdotes. They somehow connect me to this this time that I didn't live in, but it brings together all the threads of the stuff that I like. And to take this a little further, Murphy was a model for Rockwell, and later in life, he became my model as well. He had hundreds of boxes of, well, not hundreds of boxes, but 8 or 10 boxes of hundreds of photos of himself. And he said, "You want all these old photos of me? When you work on Prince Valiant, you could use them." And I found myself using a lot of his photos as reference for when I would draw men in Prince Valiant. And you can see from here, there's 2 scenes. But to take this back to this frozen moment for a second, I just want to show you the little sketch on the left was something that hung in John Cullen Murphy's studio, and it was drawn by Norman Rockwell. Rockwell inspired Murphy to want to be an illustrator, and he would oftentimes help him on some of his first assignments. And he drew this little rough layout for Murphy to help him with an arrangement of figures. Murphy did the painting beneath. He was about 18 or 19 here. But you can see how one thing leads to another, and Murphy wound up becoming this well-known illustrator himself because of these sort of frozen moments that I brought up at the beginning. He was so taken with what Rockwell was doing. He used to trip over his paintings when he would go visit him. Years later, when I started working with Murphy, and I was already in my late 30s at that time, the first page I drew with him, he sent back to me, and he had all these notes written all over it and changes he was making. And I felt pretty bad about it. And he said, well, don't think of them as changes. Think of them as alterations. I didn't quite see the difference between changes and alterations, but he was trying to help me out. Anyway, we had a great time, and it was just wonderful to be able to work with Murphy and hear all those stories about Rockwell and Dean Cornwell, and he studied under Franklin Booth, all these illustrators that I admired, not to mention Hal Foster, who was the creator of Prince Valiant, who Murphy worked with when he was younger. And by the way, speaking of originals, I'd just like to show you what an original Hal Foster, take a peek at the size of an original Hal Foster. It's almost 3 feet high. But again, it's the chance to look at these kind of original pieces of art that I think can help young artists improve rather than being stuck with mere reproductions. So again, anytime you get a chance to go to a place like the Norman Rockwell Museum, by all means, please.
Larry, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And also the wonderful anecdote about John Cullen Murphy. If anybody's interested further, there's a great book by his son, Cullen Murphy.
Yes.
And he kind of recounts some of those connections with the Golden Age illustrators. So
Yes.
love that personal background. Thank you.
Yes, Cullen Murphy was a big help when I began Prince Valiant. Again, I didn't know much about Prince Valiant, so he helped fill me in on it. He was writing it at the time. His dad was drawing it. One more little connection to Prince Valiant. When Mark Schultz was writing Prince Valiant, and I was drawing it. But again, we'd have these organic conversations. And Mark came up with this scene where, well, we'll have these people gossiping within the castle about Prince Valiant. They're gossiping about him, and I thought, oh, I think I'm going to lay that page out like that that post cover that Norman Rockwell did. And so, if you see here, it's a little nod to Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post cover. This Prince Valiant page. Again, here's a little aside. While I was doing Prince Valiant, a big fan of the comic strip was Ray Bradbury, and I got to know Ray Bradbury. And he asked me through a friend if I would like to do something with him. And what developed was a small little book, not much more than a rough screenplay treatment that he had written back in the 60s. And we came out with this small little booklet of the Nefertiti Tut Express. I had to work fast with this because at the time he was becoming more and more ill. And unfortunately, we managed to get it printed, and he did see it. It was the last thing Ray ever saw in his life as one of his printed pieces. And he was originally going to sign these as well, but it didn't work out that way. But he was a wonderful man, and I'm sure many people out there have Ray Bradbury stories, and they do know what a great guy he was as well. I got a phone call from him once, and after he discussed some of the sketches I was working on with him, this was on an answering machine. He said, well, call me back and we'll talk about the sketches. Please, this is Ray Bradbury. Call me and we'll talk about the future. And I thought, how cool is that? To talk about the future with Ray Bradbury? And not necessarily, I took that as not my future, but the future. A wonderful man. About the time I quit Prince Valiant, I decided to move on. I got a call from New York, and they wanted to know if I wanted to work on a calendar of George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire series. And I said, oh, you want me to paint a picture for the calendar? And I said, oh, that's great. What month? And they said, well, the whole calendar, 12 months. And that was my beginning of what was about to become a few years of working on George's work, which was another, again, a big thrill for me. I had not read any of his books, and nor had I seen the television show, which appealed to him because he liked the idea of my work and my impressions being derived from his actual text as opposed to the television show, which was a whole different art form. And he wanted to try and stay away from the television series. So he would actually look for artists who would be able to work that way. For example, here's a picture of Tyrion. And we weren't, any artist who works on the series of Ice and Fire, they can't use, for example, they can't use Peter Dinklage as a likeness. So we have to kind of come up with our own concepts of what these characters look like in our own minds. Now, this goes back to your question about the proprietary fan possession of beloved characters and so forth. And I think I did pretty well with my interpretations of the characters in Game of Thrones, of Ice and Fire. Many of the people who come up to me at shows say, "Oh yeah, I see your characters more so than I see the actor on television," which is very flattering because you're working with the theater of the mind. People who read books instantly have these images in their heads that they create, which leads me to a whole nother discussion that we could spend hours on. Why do authors like or even entertain the notion of having illustrators crystallize what they're writing about? Especially an author like George R.R. Martin, he's creating illustrations directly in the reader's mind. Why bring another actor into the equation in the form of an illustrator? When I asked George about this one time, and I thought maybe I'm shooting myself in the foot here, he gave a great reply. He said, "Well, I just like to see what artists do with my work." I mean, you can't ask for a more gracious reply than that. And what a blank check to take the stress off of an illustrator when an author gives you an answer like that. So that endeared me to George R.R. Martin, and I felt a lot easier on the draw.
By the way, Gary,
that.
I just wanted to say I absolutely adore that the Tyrion picture a couple of slides ago. As I'm guilty, I only watched the show, but it was a very powerful moment there. And in your picture, I feel like you captured the powerful heaviness of that moment too. So
I like the quiet moments in his books, especially the quiet moments. I think the big tentpole cataclysmic scenes are actually a little easier to do than the subtle things. And that picture, for me anyway, let me just go back a second there, has a great deal of pathos in it. You actually feel sorry for Tyrion, and without giving too much away for anyone who hasn't read the book, it is a powerful moment. And much like Emcee Wyeth's paintings, I'm thinking of the Death of Robin Hood, for example. I love that painting. The pathos in that picture is just something that goes beyond technique. And Wyeth was such a humanitarian. He was great at imbuing those qualities into his work that make for these moments that aren't just action scenes like this. But here's another one of these things. This is my Norman Rockwell moment, and as far as the Song of Ice and Fire books go. It's where Ned returns this big sword to Arya, and well, I'm a father, and when my daughters were little, I'd say things like, well, it's not a really great idea to maybe run around with scissors or something like that. And these kind of things made a great connection when I read this scene where Ned is debating whether or not this little kid should run around with a sword or not. But I got the initial idea for the layout from an Emcee Wyeth painting. And you can easily see here the progression. I won't even try to describe it, but it goes from rough to hiring a model, using myself as Ned, and creating the finished picture, which again, I consider to be one of these quiet moments that George Martin is really great at writing. I was hoping I'd be able to catch a little bit of that father-daughter relationship that guys like Rockwell and Emcee Wyeth were able to catch so well.
Very beautiful.
Thank you. And then there's I did loads of pen line drawings for some of his books. This is the wedding scene, Joffrey's wedding scene. And again, on a picture like this, I think I have the original over here somewhere. Oh, good Lord. But just to give you an idea of the size, it's a fairly good size piece. But it's wonderful to be able to work back and forth. There's a slight shift of mental gears that have to take place going from pen line to paint. But there's something that I think about a pen line that is, there's an abstraction to it, even if you're doing something representational, that allows a viewer to fill in the blanks. So I think black and white line work is so appropriate for text in books, even maybe a little more than finished paintings. Because again, it allows somebody to maybe complete the picture. It's a theory I could spend more time on, but we really.
Gary, we're actually, since I know we have about 15 slides left, if there were just important parts of the slides we wanted to run through, just so we're not too
right.
time.
We'll come to this, and we're just about finished here. This is again one of the Daenerys paintings I did, and I got the idea from a Frank Schoonover painting, and you can see the connection from the initial original source, the source material, to where I took it, and I leaned pretty heavily on that picture to create that.
Yay, Khaleesi.
Yay.
Sorry, big fan.
But then I had another chance to do a Khaleesi picture, this time a pen line illustration. And here again, you can see it helps to have a good model to work with. And again, I have some source material. You see this French Orientalist painting from the 19th century. I don't know quite what's going on here. It's a woman amusing a stork. I don't know what. I don't know why you need to amuse a stork, but it's probably a lot easier than to amuse a dragon or amuse a stork than a dragon. But at any rate, you can see that the chain of the tapestry running through these pictures from rough.
Quick question from the online audience. I think from the Jeffrey's wedding picture, they asked, "Is that your dog?"
No, it wasn't my dog. That's a simple answer. I'm glad I could give you a simple.
Thank you. Perfect.
So here we went from the pencil to the finished ink. So you can see a little bit of the train of thought running through the images. Okay, well that brings us up to our current time here. And this book just came out this week. It's H.P. Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu through Flesk.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And for the cover, I painted this image from the book of where a sculptor creates his image of Cthulhu. A friend of mine, Randy, immediately after he saw the painting, he said, "I know where you stole that from. That's from that 1925 silent film, The Magician." It's amazing how some people can grab that stuff, but I was happy to hear that he was able to make that connection. I have no problem with people being able to. They should know where this stuff comes from, because again, I think it's important to explain where you get your ideas, the nature of creativity. But the reason I bring this book up, and it just came out, I did about 100 pencil drawings for it. And it is the first time I have used any kind of photoshopping or digital media to enhance the drawings. And I actually tinted several of them in Photoshop. I only have rudimentary skills. I couldn't even figure out how to do this Zoom presentation today if it weren't for Carl and Pat. But here you can see a little bit of what I'm doing in this book. And I was actually quite happy with it, which makes me come right up to date. And I know that one of the questions was, where do I think the future is going with art and fantasy and science? And I would just have to say, I think there'll be even more of a fusion of technology and the arts. And I can't wait to see what people are doing in the future. I just read an article the other day about Disney's research and development department. I think it's called Imagineering, and they're working on a robot of Groot that the reporter who saw it said it was so lifelike. It even had all kinds. It's a big advancement from the animatronics that they have. So it's amazing that things are being done. I'll conclude with this last note. The book I'm working on now and is about to come out in the next few weeks is a fine. It's almost hard to describe, because now I'm going back about 150 years with the book. It's a fine press edition of the letterpress edition of The Case of Death and Honey, a story by Neil Gaiman, a Sherlock Holmes story, wonderful story. The book has about 30 inkline illustrations and a frontispiece, but it's all done with hand hot metal type press, where it's all done in the old-fashioned way, the kind of things we haven't seen in 150 years. The artisans working on this book are amazing. I'm just one of the cogs in the wheel of all these artists. The book in and of itself will be an object of beauty. I can't wait to see this come out. It's all handmade. It's done in a style that we haven't seen books like this in 100 years. And you can see that from the last slide, where I'm trying to look into the future. I hope I still haven't lost touch with the past as well. Anyway, I think I've come to the end, and unless there's any more questions, we're good to go.
Gary, that was a phenomenal presentation. We thank you so much for that tour through your incredible life's work. And, we look forward to all that is to come. The art is just remarkable. So thank you so much for working with us to put this together.
Thank you for having me, and I hope everyone has a great night.
I just want to quickly reiterate, thank you also, Gary. You did a real great job of getting through a lot of stuff there. So I appreciate it. I feel like we got through a lot there.
Yeah, we did get through. Sorry if I went on.
Oh, it's no problem.
It was phenomenal.
Yeah. I also want to thank the audience for being here. And we have a few announcements to go through before we end the program. The Fantasy Symposium on October 22nd and the 23rd. And tomorrow, on August 25th, we have the Raiders of the Lost Ark event from 6:30 to 10:30 p.m.
Cool.
That'll be fun. And then on view through October 31st, we have the Enchanted History of Fantasy Illustration exhibit and the Land of Enchantment. Thank you all for joining us. And if you want to become a member, feel free to go to our website at nrm.org. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Good night.
Thank you again. Great to see you, Gary, and thanks to everybody for joining us.